While it may take a little getting used to, using data tables is extremely useful in Excel. One of the things that you have to get used to when using data tables is the unique reference text that is used with them. You are no longer simply referring to column letters and row numbers. You are using table and header names, which can be a little confusing at first. Using named ranges for drop-down selectors is something that I do regularly. It allows for a uniform entry for data and helps to limit errors in your spreadsheet. For example, I have this data table, which lists a series of file types in one row and details their file extensions and the software that they use in neighboring columns. Next to the data table, I have the same data listed in simple rows and columns. This data has not been entered into a data table, so there are limits to how Excel will behave when trying to reference this data for a dropdown. And finally, to the far right of my data, I have a little tool that will give me information about the file type I selected based off of the information in the data table. First things first, I can simply type the name of something that does not exist in the data table and see what the result is. As you can see, this brings up a not available error. The Adobe Premiere file I entered is not in the data table. Excel attempts to get the file extension and software from the table, can't find Adobe Premiere in the list, and throws an error at us. In order to limit this type of error, I want to limit what can be entered into the file type selection cell to what is available in our data table. First, though, I'm going to show why data tables are preferable to a simple array of rows and columns. The basic process for limiting the selection is to highlight the cell you want limited, select Data Validation in the Data Tools toolbar of the Data tab of the ribbon. Again, select Data Validation from the drop-down menu. This will open the Data Validation dialog box. Click the down arrow on Allow and select List. With our cursor in the source area of the Data Validation dialog box, we can select a range from our sheet. I'm going to select the data that is not in a data table. It populates the source with the absolute references to the range I selected, and we can click OK. Now, a little drop-down appears next to our cell, and we can select from the range we entered. This populates our extension and software just as we hoped. If I attempt to type something that is not included in this list, Excel will throw an error. But what if we want to expand this list? I'm going to copy the Adobe Premiere file content over to the list of files. Now, if we use our dropdown, Excel still attempts to limit to the original range we put in. This range ends at row 9 and does not include our entry into row 10. Let's undo all of that and try the same process again. Only this time, we're going to enter the data table as our limiting range. This time, I'm going to use Keystrokes. Highlight the cell and press Alt-A. This will give you an indication of everything you can do in the Data tab of the ribbon. Data Validation has a V below it, so we'll press V. This opens the drop-down menu, and we learn we can push V again to complete our Data Validation selection. Again, we select List from the Allow drop-down, and this time we're going to select the range of our data table with our cursor in the Source entry box. The entry looks very similar, but there is one important difference. Now we'll select OK, and let's check our results. All of our file types are, once again, available for selection. But look what happens when I move the Adobe Premiere data into the table. Excel automatically recognizes that the range has changed with this new entry and has changed our allowed values to include our newly added file types. Now, I'm going to undo all of this again and show one more trick that has even more potential. Remember before when I mentioned about different ways of referencing data tables using column and table names? This unique range reference language can also be used for data validations. The first thing I'm going to do is click any open cell and then highlight the data table range to give you an idea of how the language works. The first thing we need to do is enter an equal sign, then select our file type range. As you can see, Excel automatically recognizes the range as part of the data table and uses the unique data table reference language in the cell. If we hit Enter, Excel will list the contents of our entire file type column in the form of an array. We can use text that Excel entered into the cell and use this array to help us create a range that does not actually reference any rows or columns. First thing we need to do is delete the equal sign before our table reference. Now we have the range of our file type column written out for us by Excel in the data table language. We can use this text in combination with the indirect function to create a selection range. Highlight the text directly from within the cell entry and copy it. Then, follow the same process to get into the data validation dialog box. Again, we allow a list and activate our source entry box. Instead of selecting a range in our sheet, though, we're going to type a range in directly. We start first with an equal sign, then the word indirect followed by an open parenthesis, and then a quotation mark. Then we paste our data table range reference, close our quotation mark and our parenthesis, then click OK. This works in much the same way as selecting the range directly in the sheet, but it opens up all kinds of different possibilities for indirectly referencing data table ranges with more complicated formulas. These possibilities are outside the range of this tutorial, but if you're curious about how this concept can be expanded, watch for further videos on the subject here.